One man, Provost George Salmon, once stated that over my dead body will women enter this college. Yet one of his last acts as provost was the dropping of the veto in 1901. He died in 1904, the first year that women were admitted to study in Trinity, so he got his wish. The college was founded by a powerful woman, Queen Elizabeth I, in 1592, yet women were only admitted to Trinity over 300 years later. Change comes dropping slow.
What I'm going to tell you will seem shocking to modern ears, but you must have thought that we women were all crushed by this. But in reality, since we knew no better, we accepted it.
It happened all so gradually. You sort of didn't see it as a major change coming anywhere, you know, really.
They really had to face huge physical as well as mental changes to accommodate a posse of young women who weren't going to sit down anymore.
I never questioned it. It just seemed normal.
My name is Barbara Wright, and my position in Trinity is that I'm a Fellow Emerita. I was an undergraduate here as well, and I studied modern languages, French and Irish. And after I graduated, I specialised in French and took a PhD in Cambridge and spent a year in Paris at the Sorbonne. My first teaching job was in the Department of French in the University of Manchester, where there were 42 members of staff. It was the second largest Department of French in the British Isles, the largest being in Glasgow at 43. I mention that because no language department has a contingent of that size anymore. And then my next job was in the University of Exeter, and then in 1965 I was appointed as a lecturer in French in Trinity. And I've been part of the furniture ever since. My grandmother, after whom I was called, Barbara Hoskin, was a suffragette. So I suppose there was something of that in the genes. And she, in 1913, along with 3 other women, protested against the lack of votes for women by throwing stones in the windows of Dublin Castle. And for that, the 4 women were jailed in Tullamore prison for a month. And some of them went on hunger strike. And so there's a tradition of that in my family, and I knew that grandmother very well. And she lived with us until I was 18. This college has been part of my entire life. I came in as a student at 17, and I just grew up within it, and there was never any feature of it that was alien to me.
My name is Corinna Salvadori. I was appointed in the summer of '61, in July actually, and I was appointed as a junior lecturer in the college. That was the most junior position. You did 3 years as a junior lecturer, and then, all being well, you were promoted to the lecturer scale. I had been told that I was to put no hopes in getting the job because I had 3 things against me. One was that I was a woman, and they really did not want women in Trinity, nor indeed anywhere else, if you asked me, in 1961. And the other was that I was a Catholic, and that the Protestant ethos of the college would absolutely not want a Catholic. I was not Irish and wasn't British either. That would have been a great help, that I was Italian. And it isn't that Italians, especially in 61, not all that long after the war, etc., would really have a very good press in an English mentality, let us say, because all of that was not true. Now, in case you think I was great, I wasn't. I was the only applicant, apparently, who could be considered seriously for the job. So I actually got the job. Italian was seen as a papist language and was not taught generally in Northern Irish schools, whereas German was taught predominantly. And the German department was a very strong one, supported mainly by Northern Irish, good, very good schools who sent very good students.
I had studied German in UCC, had spent time in Germany and had done my postgraduate years in Oxford in St Hilda's College, and then a vacancy arose in Trinity for a junior lecturer, and I applied, and to my great delight I was appointed. My mother was made a professor at a very young age, so I never saw any barriers to women going anywhere. I never really thought about it, to be honest, because she had attained so much, and I saw no reason why everybody else shouldn't fulfill their potential as well.
My name is Christine Meek, and I'm a medieval historian working on medieval Italy. I worked in the department of, first of all, medieval history, and then when it joined with modern history, from 1964 until I retired in 2007. When I came for an interview, I did what, of course, everybody does, looking around the plane to look at potential rivals. And I managed to find a few, which was really quite funny, because when it came to the interview, I was the only candidate interviewed. I actually succeeded Leland Lyons, if you can imagine this, as I'm a medieval historian and he was a modern Irish historian. Needless to say, in those days, the salary was absolute peanuts. I can remember by the time I came, it had been put up from, I think it was £950 a year to the dizzy heights of £1,050 a year. But as you can imagine, it was fairly difficult to live on that. I used to spend as little as I could during term so that I could go to Italy, largely at my own expense. There weren't the kind of research facilities and research financing, research funding that there is nowadays. And I then used to live in a kind of modest hotel or an extremely Spartan room in someone's house and kind of eat cheese and bread and oranges and things for lunch and that kind of thing.
I was an undergraduate in Bedford College, University of London, and then I did a DPhil in Oxford in theoretical physics, and spent a year in Durham standing in for somebody who was on academic leave, and then I got a job in Trinity and I've been here ever since. But certainly I was the only woman in either maths or physics when I first arrived. Professor Walton was in physics at that stage, and yes, it was partly because of him that I was appointed in a way, because he wanted somebody to teach theoretical physics to the physicists. So I always taught electromagnetic theory and quantum mechanics in the physics department, and that would have been to physicists and theoretical physicists. And then later we added elementary particle theory. I was used to being in a fairly all-male atmosphere, both in Oxford and in Durham for the year I was there. But no, everybody was very welcoming. I got on very well with everybody. There wasn't, what I didn't have was a sort of group working on particle theory. There were other people, but I wasn't immediately absorbed into a group.
I grew up with the notion to third level I had to go. And it wasn't called third level in those days, it was just Trinity. That was the only place you could go. I was terrified, absolutely terrified. And I was doing this course called Social Studies, and I didn't really know what it was. And it was basically because I didn't know what I wanted to do that I ended up doing that. I can remember not knowing where to go, and having to ask a young lad where was something, wherever it was, and you know, the actual addressing a young fellow was a major problem for me.
The fact that the social science course was a mere diploma and not a degree course in Vivienne Darling's day shows what low regard the caring professions courses were held in a largely male institution.
We weren't really recognised as part of the university. We were sort of like external students or something. We didn't wear gowns like everybody else. All the other students were wearing gowns, and this was, you know, we saw this as a bit of a deprivation. I was offered a job as an assistant to the person running the social science course at that point, so back I came. And that's how I started in Trinity. It was about 48, 49 at this point. I stayed in that department for 41 years, I think.
Vivienne has seen immense changes for women, not only in college, but in Irish society generally.
It's unheard of, contraception, you know. And the secrecy, I mean, the fact that the girl got pregnant was the horror for any family. And I mean, they were hidden away and sent away to have their babies and pretended to be in a job in England and all that sort of thing. So much fewer people in the Church of Ireland, yes, but it would be just as much a disgrace.
There was no financial support for women who got into trouble, as they called it, until the early 1970s.
The passing of the unmarried parents' allowance enabled a lot of single mothers to keep kids, not have to place them for adoption.
My name is Yvonne Scannell, and I'm a recently retired professor in the law school in Trinity. And now I work as a consultant with Arthur Cox Solicitors, and I'm also Vice President of the European Nuclear Energy Authority. I decided to go to Trinity when I was 14 years of age because I loved history, and my favourite characters in history were Lord Edward Fitzgerald, Robert Emmet and Wolfe Tone. And Robert Emmet and Wolfe Tone had both come to Trinity. I don't know whether Lord Edward had. And I thought, I want to go to some place like that. And I wanted to go really because at some level I felt this was a place where your independence and your right to say what you wanted would be respected, and that it was tolerant and forward-looking and excellent and had a sense of ethos that I liked. I think the best situation is a mix of men and women, fairly equally balanced. But I do think women are better at having new ideas and caring about the students. Not always now, and there are lots of exceptions to it. But I think maybe it's our motherly instincts or whatever. Certainly after I became a mother, I actually became a much better teacher.
I did my master's in Toronto. I made a conscious decision to work for a year to see whether I preferred that. And I decided, no, I think I wanted to go back and do a PhD, so I did a PhD in Edinburgh, and then I ended up, I took 5 years out when my children were small, effectively when I was finishing the PhD, and then until they were at school. And then I came back into academia in 1980. The professor of computer science, John Byrne, was hugely supportive. He was a great mentor to me, both when I was an undergraduate and then when I joined the department. He was very, very supportive, and you know, he gave me space to adjust back into the academic world.
In academia at that time, when you got a job, you did what they told you to do. So the first subjects I got to teach were not the subjects I would have wanted to teach. But it was actually very good for me because it gave me a great grounding in subjects which I subsequently dropped. And as you got older in the system and progressed, you eventually got to teach what you really wanted to teach. So for example, my interests developed rather accidentally into environmental law. And I got to teach that in 1978. And we were the first university in Europe, as far as I know, that taught environmental law.
People of my generation in the 50s, men and women, accepted almost unquestioningly the idea that they would have to emigrate to make their careers. So with that caveat, I can tell you that life was delightful for women, but it did have its limitations. As is well known, women had to be off the campus at 6 p.m. in the evening, and if you came in after 6, you signed in a book in the porters, they used to call them porters in those days, now they're security officers, in the porter's lodge at the front gate. And you signed because if you came in after 6, you were supposed to come for one or other of two purposes. One would be to read in the reading room, and two would be to attend a meeting of a student society. And that was basically what you were supposed to be doing, and then everybody had to clear out by 10 p.m.
But there were very few women around. We may have been 5 or 6, that is all. And we were in a strange situation because, for example, the college was male residential, and I accepted that. I accepted that there were rules here, that because this was like, I won't say Borstal, but army barracks is what I think. There were times when you could come and times when you had to exit, and that was all there was to it.
Women had to be out of the gates at 6 o'clock, but the social science lectures went on till 7:30. So special arrangements had to be made for this. And we had to therefore sign out at the front gate to make sure we went out.
The 60s was a period of great change in the world. Music, fashion, politics and civil rights were all changing, and Trinity was not immune.
Provost McConnell hadn't been long in office, I think, and he was determined to move Trinity forward. In the post-war years, Trinity had kind of got stuck in a rut. There were very few women teachers and very few Catholic teachers on the staff. So I was one of the first of the new contingent of people who came.
All changed on campus in 1968, and one of the biggest changes was that young women with chaperones moved into number 33.
They needed members of staff to chaperone the students who were living in. So Vivienne, Darling and I shared a front door on the top of 33 and had a flat each on either side of a central corridor. And there were about half a dozen girls living down the corridor from us. I arrived in 1968, which was the first year that women were allowed to live in college. And it was the first year that there were women foundation scholars. That was why they had to live in, because foundation scholars live in.
At this point, I was Vice Warden of Trinity Hall. I was asked if I would go and live in as well. So I was the first woman to live officially and singly in college. When Mackenzie's went on fire, we all had to leave our accommodation in the middle of the night. Strange the number of women wandering around Front Square at that point. Although our 7 of us were the only official ones.
While women worked within systems that were set and run according to men's preferences, being pragmatic as women are, they found ways around the barriers that they met. Everything from access to lunch facilities to access to the library.
My biggest trouble at the beginning was the library. I needed to work the night before on teaching what I was going to teach the next morning. I was only a beginner. There was a lot I didn't know, and I needed to use the library till late at night. So the assistant librarian at the time, Mr. Hurst, he found a little room to which I had access, and it was in a corridor really linking 2 bits of the library. And the 2 other women were given the option as well, 2 junior lecturers like myself. My big advantage was we could bring in our typewriters and we could type notes, which made it great rather than doing by hand. You didn't have the Xeroxing facilities and all that quite yet. And this was just wonderful. We were facilitated, which meant then we could leave until later. But then, you see, gradually, it was a question of evolution. They couldn't keep that rule of women out at whatever time because it just wasn't making sense with undergraduates who needed to study and exam preparation.
The formal evening meal, commons, was a no-go area for women for a very long time. And that changed only after a battle.
The problem for the women also there was that they weren't actually part of the college structure in the same way. For example, commons was compulsory for men students, but women weren't allowed on commons, commons being the formal evening meal. I became a scholar in 1954. That's another competitive examination. And I got that in 1954, and I didn't realize at the time that I was among the first women to be invited to a Trinity Monday dinner. Now that was 1954, and I think it had only been possible for about 2 years prior to that. And then I do know of one woman who was elected to scholarship in 1948. And I have to say their fate was not too bad either, because in lieu of the Trinity Monday dinner, they had dinner in Jamais. Now, Chez Jamais was a French restaurant just across the road in Nassau Street, which was the acme of gastronomy. So you could argue that they were given a better dinner, but nevertheless, some of them felt in hindsight that they should have been included, and I think most would now agree that.
It seems hard to believe now, but until as late as the 1960s, basics for women, such as somewhere simply to sit, somewhere to be, or to eat lunch, drink a cup of coffee, or do your ironing, or have your baby minded, were few and far between.
There was nowhere you could go to have a cup of coffee. Then Miss Franks, a lady called Miss Franks, ran a restaurant which was open for lunch, but she opened it in the morning for coffee.
The Elizabethan Society, of course, was a society for women when they couldn't join the Phil or the Hist. But I believe it ran a lunchroom, and it had things like an iron and an ironing board, and presumably places where women could sit.
The men were getting a meal, commons, every evening, and I couldn't see why women couldn't have commons as well. Now, there were all sorts of rules. You couldn't possibly have it in the dining hall. Right, I said, but can't we have it served in the room beside the dining hall where nobody sees us, but we're getting the hot meal? And that happened. Nobody thought that odd.
There was something called Ladies' Commons, which took place in the upper lunchroom, and it had a maximum attendance of about 3.
There was a waiter called Larry. He was an institution in the place, and Larry used to serve the 4 or 5 of us women first, because he used to say you served ladies before men, and so we got served first. And then gradually everything began to change, because they began to allow women even residence overnight, female students, and you know, life was becoming different, and the college had to respond.
For women academics, the common room, an academic sitting room, was a no-go area for them. Change happened gradually as more women were appointed to the academic staff, and there was always disgruntlement from some members of the male staff.
When women were admitted to the common room, women's staff were admitted to the common room. This was a major thing. The common room was the preserve of men.
The common room was very much the sitting room, the at-home of the male residents in the college staff. They all lived rubrics, they lived here, and they went and they used the common room. They had commons in the evening, and after that they sat, they read, they smoked, whatever, they played chess in the common room. And they had a sense of it being for them, which it was in a way, which it was.
This was really something to be allowed to be a member of the senior common room.
You felt a little self-conscious and that you were intruding on somebody's space, even though many people, the younger ones in particular, would have been very nice and very welcoming. But the older ones were kind of glowering behind their newspapers at you, and you felt not approving. But within a decade, there had been a huge difference in, I think, people's attitude towards women in college. By the time I left, you were treated as equals, and you didn't quite feel like you were in a men's club when you went into the common room, which is what I felt when I came first.
The first meeting of the College Historical Society took place on Wednesday, the 21st of March, 1770. We only had to wait 206 years later for the first female auditor in 1976. And that was Mary Harney, who later went on to become Taoiseach.
With the presidency of the HIST goes traditionally membership of the University Club on St. Stephen's Green. And that was the preserve, an all-male preserve at the time, and indeed remained so for quite a little while afterwards. So this posed a problem for the administration of the University Club. And Mary Harney, this is well documented, received a letter from the secretary of the University Club congratulating her on her election to the presidency and regretting that she could not, however, become a member of the University Club, not because she was a woman, but because she was not a man.
Trinity College has produced not only a Taoiseach but eminent women senators, and has had a connection with two presidents, Mary Robinson, former student, lecturer and now Chancellor, and also the former law professor, Mary McAleese. As times changed and more women were recruited to the academic staff, pay and promotion prospects improved, but sometimes in unlikely ways and for the strangest of reasons.
I never asked for promotion, and provided everything goes well in your department, people will forget about you and won't think particularly of promoting you. And it happened that we had deans established, and a particular dean, Nigel Glendinning, a wonderful Hispanist, suddenly came in to see me in the department, and he said, "But you should really not be a lecturer anymore. You now deserve promotion to senior lecturer." And very kindly he saw that I had that promotion. And equally it was a very good colleague in medieval English who had read some of my written work, and he came several years later and said, "You should be a fellow of the college," and he applied for me and I became a fellow. And then that same man became dean and he applied for an associate professorship, and I got the associate professorship.
I think in some departments where there were women and they would be fairly junior, they might be treated as little pets. And this didn't happen if you were in a department where the professor was a woman. I do remember on one occasion, I can't remember quite which appointment it was, when we looked at the list of candidates, she expressed a hope that we could appoint a man, because she didn't want it to be thought that medieval history was a subject that was primarily done by women. Now, we did appoint a man. There was no suggestion that we were going to appoint a man come what may. The person appointed was a man. And this is absolutely the only occasion I've ever heard anyone express a desire for one gender rather than the other.
As for being a woman, Trinity had one amazing thing. In the advertisement for the job, they did not make a distinction between male and female. There was just one pay scale. That was very surprising, because women in Ireland at the time, and not only in Ireland, were paid substantially less than men, and especially married women were not given permanent employment in a lot of sectors in society. For example, in Raduaran, where my parents worked, I know my mother was not discriminated against. She simply fell into a category as a married woman that made her get 1/3 of what my father was getting for what more or less was the same work. That was standard in the country. And it may be a bit of a joke, I don't know. But when I asked a few years later, the lovely bursar we had, Basil Chubb, how come the college had never done pay differentials? He said, "We never thought we'd be employing women, so it wasn't worth it having two separate scales." May or may not have been true. We were not many at the beginning.
Changing times in the 60s also brought about childcare facilities on campus, initially to facilitate staff.
Why do we have a creche? That began because the Dean of Women, a woman called Anne Bramble, wonderful person, the Dean of Women, in where women were allowed to have so to speak, a common room, an independent life of their own, and that was house number 6. There were lockers there for the women students to leave their belongings. They had a room where they could meet, and the women members of staff also had a room there where we could meet. So if you want, that was a little segregation place for ourselves. And one day, Miss Bramble heard what at first she thought was a cat, and then she decided it wasn't a cat, and she explored, and it was a baby crying, a very, very young baby. And its mother had had to go to her lecture, and she had not been able to leave the child anywhere, so she had put it in her locker with her belongings. Now the lockers did have, slits, so there was air. She was not being totally irresponsible. In fact, she wasn't being irresponsible at all. It was a safe place. Now, then began the request for a creche. And at the time, the idea of having a workplace that offered child-minding facilities, it was unheard of, let alone for students or staff or for anybody. And she persevered, and that same nice bursar, Professor Chubb, he was political economist, and Professor Chubb supported it in the end. It took a while of convincing, supported it, and it's in fact out by the College Medical Centre, and it's been thriving ever since.
Fellowship is a highly valued tradition in Trinity. It recognises the contribution of an academic for their research work, their publications and their contribution to college life. Fellowship was the sole preserve of men until 1968, even though senior women on the staff were among the leading academics in their field. Ita Kirwan, or O'Boyle as she was then, and Barbara Wright were 2 of the first women fellows ever appointed to Trinity College Dublin.
Well, fellowship is a very important part of the structure of this university. It actually belongs to the provost, fellows and scholars. And fellowship is an honour conferred by competition, based primarily on publications, but also on commitment to the college. And it implies that if one is elected to fellowship, one is, in a sense, linked by a very special bond to the college. And it implies a degree of devotion to the college, ideally.
There was Professor Otway Riven, who was perhaps nearing retirement, and there were then Catherine Brock, Barbara Wright and myself, all of whom had been at the normal age. We were in our early 30s. So that was a huge day in the history of the college. I mean, I still have cuttings from the newspaper of the following day, all our photographs down there, women elected fellows in Trinity for the first time, and a big write-up of each of us, and it was just headline news, which today people take for granted.
There were 5 women appointed to fellowship in 1968. 2 were older, that is Professor Frances Moran and Professor Jocelyn Otway Riven, and in all honesty, they should have been elected to fellowship many years prior to that.
I got fellowship because Professor Scattergood in English, a medievalist, knew about my work, and indeed my work on later period even than Middle Ages, and came to see me with a form and asked me questions, and I don't think I signed that form. He sent it on my behalf, and I became a fellow.
I was the first woman by accident of chronology to become a senior fellow, and that happened at the period just leading up to the university legislation, which in fact so modified the role of senior fellows that it became altered, I think irrevocably.
Over time, more women have been appointed to fellowship, but at a much lower rate than their male counterparts, for a variety of reasons. Family commitments, caring responsibilities, publishing rates and other factors such as unconscious bias all played a part.
When I wanted to go for promotion to associate professor, I needed the support of the dean. So I went to him and said, you know, I've published 5 books and I've got an award for being the top European lawyer this year, and I would like to be promoted to associate professor. And he said, oh, why are you doing this? You don't need the money. And so, I mean, that was the dean who might have been mentoring me if I'd had to have a mentor.
Certainly in academia, men who have children do better and get promoted, and women who have children do worse. So clearly there's something going on around what women having to take time out to have children. But I think there are a lot of unconscious prejudices and biases going on.
One of the biggest challenges for any woman in the workplace is combining a career with a family. Each of these Trinity women who had children found their own solutions to their childcare arrangements. The one word that comes to mind is heroic, and when you listen to the stories of how each woman had their children and combined that with their demanding careers, you can only be astounded.
The term maternity leave was not known at that stage. Absolutely not known. But I had terrific help at home, and my parents lived nearby, and I found a series of solutions. But the thing was to keep going.
There was no maternity leave for me as a part-time lecturer. I'm not sure if there was. There must have been something for full-time people. But there was nothing. So for my first child it was all right because he was born in the middle of the summer, so by the time term started I could put him in the creche.
I had married a member of staff from the chemistry department, and we had 2 children with a 4-year gap between them, and both my children were born over an Easter weekend. My daughter on Monday, Thursday, my son on Good Friday, because the Monday, fortunately, was a public holiday and I was able to be away until the Tuesday I was back at work. That was all that you could do, because there was no way that in a small department you could have taken time out. I didn't have any leave of absence, for study leave as they call it now, in the first 27 years of my teaching. Not 7 years, but 27. My work was essential to continue whether I had a child or didn't have a child.
In one way, academic life is very good for work-life balance because your hours are relatively flexible. And the way I managed it basically was, I was always there for the children's dinner. And when they went to bed at 8 o'clock, I worked until 12 or 1 or 2 or 3, because I was a night worker. So it actually suited me. In fact, my brother one time was staying with us and he was going down the stairs. It was 6 o'clock in the morning and I didn't even realize that. But I was writing and time flew. So for a night worker, it was wonderful because I was going to work at night time anyway. My life was children, work, and relatives visiting. But I didn't have a really good social life otherwise because I was too focused now, I think, on trying to be a good scholar and a good academic.
For women academics who wanted to combine marriage and family and an academic career, there was no support either for childcare or research, and working part-time wasn't facilitated either, it seems, unless it suited the college's needs.
When I was having small children, I wanted to be able to look after them a bit myself. I didn't want to rely entirely on au pairs. And so I asked David if I could go part-time. And he said yes, that would be fine, but he warned me that it would not be easy or maybe not even possible to get back to full-time. But I felt there wasn't anything else I could do at that stage. And he said to me, you know, what did I could be half-time, and did I want it to be in research or teaching or a mixture of the two? And I thought a bit and I thought, you can't do research half-time. You're either doing it or not, really. I didn't see how that would work. So I said, I'll do it as teaching.
For those who opted to go part-time, the penalty for their choices were severe. No pension rights, no research support, and consequently falling behind on the promotional ladder.
All the years I was part-time, I wasn't paying into the college pension fund. When I was part-time, there were all sorts of things I was not allowed to do, such as apply for fellowship or to be a tutor. But they made an exception for me and made me a senior lecturer a couple of years before I got back to full-time. And I did more and more teaching and working with people. And yes, the other thing I couldn't do while I was part-time was have a research student. But when I got back to full-time, I did have a research student in theoretical magnetism, doing computer modelling of magnetic systems.
What the experience of these women shows is that research support plays a key role for women academics, especially those with caring or family responsibilities.
If we want to help women academics, the most useful thing we can do is, at that key period, to enable them not to take their eye off the research ball. They can drop the teaching because they can come back to that enriched by their experience. They can drop the administrative work because that they can pick up at any time. But if they lose a link in the research chain, they may find it very difficult ever to pick it up again, and it's all so competitive that the young Turks coming up behind them will have stolen a march. Provided no irretrievable mistake is made in the 20s, you then reach the 30s, which I think is the trickiest of all, because it's when all that you've built up comes to fruition, in your research work particularly. And if you lose a trick at that point, it's terribly hard to pick up again. And sadly for women, that is the time when nature dictates that if they are going to have a family, they'd better start thinking about it then.
Women are moving into a new phase of recognition for their work, their research and their value in college. But in order for this progress to be maintained and improved, there's a need to measure and to be eternally vigilant.
If you want to improve gender equality, then the starting point is to gather the data. You need to gather quite a sophisticated and complex data set. So you need to look at the pipeline numbers, the number of undergraduates, the number of postgrads, the number of postdocs, the number of junior faculty, and going all the way up to professors. You need to do that. But you need to look at, for example, representation on committees. You need to look at how long it takes for people to be promoted. You need to look at points on scales where people are appointed to make sure there's no gender pay gap. So there's a multitude of different pieces of data that you have to gather, and you need to do it on an ongoing basis.
The number of women students in 1906 was 8. The number now is over 10,000. 58% of the student population are women, well beyond the 30% point of critical mass, the tipping point. And yet the number of women senior professors is still at 18%.
One of the things about universities is they always say they're meritocratic institutions, and people only get appointed on the basis of merit, and they only get promoted on the basis of merit. But when you look at the arithmetic of academia, it's telling you a different story.
For change to continue into the future, what the experience of these women tells us is that there's always a need for heroic, pragmatic women. There's always going to be a need for the support of enlightened men, as in earlier times. That continuous measurement and benchmarking against best practice at home and abroad, combined with eternal vigilance, is essential. And that the next generation need to take up the baton and to continue to press for change and greater equality.
Fundamentally, we need to change the culture, and the culture has to be one that is about making sure that we support everybody to achieve their full potential. Because if we don't, that is a terrible waste of talent. I mean, if more or less half our academic staff are women, and we're not creating an environment in which they can develop to their full potential, the university is losing out. It's losing out in the rankings. I mean, even if you didn't make the percentage of professors who are women one of the criteria in the rankings, even if you didn't do that, we're losing out because half of our staff are not achieving as much as they could.
There are barriers there which are visible and invisible. And I think one of the things about women is that they don't look for the invisible barriers. We don't instinctively know how power is wielded, and it's something we'll just have to learn.
What needs to change now? What are the visible and invisible barriers women are accepting today that in years to come others will look back on and ask why? Some things still need to change.
There needs to be a change in attitude towards women who put themselves out there, be it for promotion, for a position of leadership, or even just speaking in a lecture theatre. They ought to be supported and encouraged by other genders and, of course, by other women. All changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born.